Mike Pompeo has recently said the U.S. government is looking into TikTok and perhaps touting banning other Chinese apps. This comes after the country India has also banned the Chinese app TikTok, as well as a few others, as a result of their security concerns with the nation of China. Could an army of dancing 15-year-olds on TikTok really be aiding a massive communist security apparatus? Well, we'll talk about that and more on this episode of the Tonic Accord. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Tonic Accord. We're going to be talking about TikTok today, among other things, about the tech industry and applications and what they mean for society. But to start off, what does this tell you, Alex? The fact that, we've seen India ban TikTok after border and security disputes with China. And now Mike Pompeo was on CNN saying that he and Trump are looking into TikTok, among other things. What does that tell you?
Okay, so there's a lot for me personally to unpack here. First off, I just want to put it out on the record that I freaking hate TikTok in every way possible. I think it's a complete, just horrid app. I didn't even know about it till recently, till some of my students last year were using it and telling me, oh, check it out, it's great. It's cringy, it's annoying, and I'm actually okay if it's gone. But I do think it's important that we remember that, yes, TikTok is a Chinese company. And I am sure, beyond doubt, that they are using user data for nefarious purposes. But I also think we do need to remember that TikTok and the app version of TikTok that Westerners are using is not the same app that is being used in mainland China. And I do feel that the United States and a lot of the West is very angry at China, and rightfully so. But I just wonder if TikTok should be the app that we want to go to die on, the battle that we want to go to die on, because I think it needs to be reformed and we need to look into it. But I'm not sure if this is the most important one, personally.
Well, I mean, look, you can do two things at once, right? We've talked about Huawei and their phones and how you don't see Huawei phones in the United States for a reason. I think TikTok might just be it's the one getting headlines, but it might just be a new way that China is gathering data on the world, along with many other ways. Again, just so we can have a little bit of context for those that don't know, TikTok is an app where it's just basically 15 to 20 seconds of content, mostly people under, the articles I say under 30. I would even argue say under 22. Very, very young demographic of people. And it's mostly just lip singing to songs, funny dances, funny comedy skits. It was based off of a different app earlier, a few years ago, called Musical.ly. I think they got absorbed or either bought out or just basically became TikTok. But yeah, it's really innocuous content on the surface. But the issue, so I don't want anyone to think that it's some we're not pumping Chinese propaganda into 15-year-olds, right? But what the concern is that TikTok is gathering data in such a way that is way more so than even other apps like Facebook and YouTube and Google. The apps that people just assume, yeah, of course they're going to take my data now. It's kind of just, everyone has kind of given up, right? Oh, I just click the terms of service, they take my data. Well, there still actually is restrictions on what Facebook can do, and the way that they store that data is also very important. And TikTok is just kind of blowing those other apps out of the water. And so that's why this is a big concern. And of course, their ties to the Chinese government, being a Chinese-based company or parent company, is what's really concerning. That they have access to everything. And so just real quickly, someone on Reddit actually reverse engineered the site, and he was a programmer, and he explained, and other people that reverse engineer apps backed this up. This is one of the most popular posts on Reddit in the last few months. He basically went, look, to call it a social network, it's a data collection service that is a thinly veiled social network. He basically said they get your phone hardware, your CPU type, your hardware ID, your screen dimensions, your memory usage, disk space. It knows all the other apps you have installed and even apps you've installed and deleted. So they're accessing historical caches of your data. Everything network related, your IP, your local IP, your router number, your MAC, your Wi-Fi access point name. They even know whether or not your phone is jailbroken or still rooted in the original system. They're getting all of that. That's way more than what Facebook gathers on a daily basis. Most of what Facebook gathers is, you volunteer your email and your name and your phone number. And then it usually gets your, what you're searching on Facebook, your buying history. Perhaps they have deals with Amazon to look at what you're buying on Amazon. But they're not getting your Wi-Fi access point name and some of your deleted apps from 4 years ago. So that's one of the main concerns. Is this is more so of a data collection service than what we're used to seeing, even in apps that we've already said are like bad actors.
Okay, yeah, that's first off horrifying. I mean, just to put it lightly, right? That is something that is a complete breach of user confidence, personal privacy, and pretty much every other check under the box, right? And I completely think that's abhorrent. Well, first off, I want to get into it later when we kind of maybe look into big tech as a whole. But I do think that we are allowing Facebook and some of these companies, especially Google, to do more than just have our email and our information. And I think TikTok might be exposing, the severe side of this, especially because the Chinese government, as we've talked about numerous times on this podcast, have an extreme ability to work with the private and the Communist Party to do this. But then at the same time, I do think that we have to wonder, where is this data going from TikTok? And what I found interesting when I was researching for this podcast is that TikTok is led by an American CEO with hundreds of employees and key leaders across safety, security, products, and public policy in the United States. And most of the company's data centers are outside of China, and they have separated themselves from ByteDance, I think that's what it is, which is the operating company of TikTok. So I'm extremely concerned, like you, about what they're doing with this data and the fact that they can look into your old, your deleted apps, your Wi-Fi access points, and all those other things you mentioned. And I am extremely concerned about that. But I am not as concerned about them as, say, a Huawei or something, which is obviously a whole different point, and it probably is moot in this whole thing. But I just think that I think TikTok is exposing just the tip of the iceberg to maybe what even some American companies and Western companies have been doing for a long time, but the Chinese are just really bad at covering it up.
Yeah, I mean, that could be true. I still think, like, look, again, I went off a guy's Reddit post, right? I'm not a programmer. I'm not an expert. I think we do something so complex like this. We kind of do have to rely on our security experts, because I mean, look, China's in some hot water globally. That's for sure, especially with the United States. So maybe Mike Pompeo's jumping the gun. I mean, but India's security systems and apparatus, they're no dummies over there. They understand some of these things, and they decided to ban TikTok among other Chinese apps. They're in closer proximity, of course, but I wonder, I do worry, and you're right. Maybe this is a strange hill to die on. And the one thing that'd be interesting is, again, they're just looking into this right now, right? So if the United States decides to ban TikTok, I also wonder what China's response will be, right? Because they're not going to be pleased about that, and it might hurt, might cause more tension in the trade war. But we also have to remember too that, it's not just Chinese companies that are benefiting the Chinese government. There's also American companies that are doing work with China. One example is Google. Google there was a protest of Google employees 2 years ago that people left the company because they were put on a secret project that was helping the Chinese government censor their search engine, like Google's search engine within China, to block out stuff, massacres and things against the Chinese government. On top of that, that Google has accepted to work with the Chinese government in one instance, and in another instance denied working with the U.S. military, for ethical concerns, which is, in my opinion, pretty hypocritical, and so I also think that, like, moving the discussion to bigger tech in general, we also have to look at what American companies are doing to benefit China. And how many of our companies have factories there, and how many of our companies have deals there, and are agreeing to not talk ill of them.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was kind of looking into Google earlier too, and the Hill, who I've been really getting into some of the Hill's articles and writing, and they had a really good article kind of on big tech as a geopolitical force, and they had a really interesting point, which I think is 100% accurate, is that through history, basically, government has had a monopoly over public surveillance, citizen data, and influencing and mobilizing citizens. But companies, especially Google and their parent company Alphabet, have almost muddled these waters, where you're seeing a private company that obviously, yes, did get government subsidies, and I would not say is completely private anymore, but you're seeing a company that has met with the Chinese government more times than a lot of Western countries combined in the last decade. And you're seeing them craft policies with China as kind of a quasi-government in some ways. And I think that is somewhat very concerning and just alarming. And there's a really interesting book I read a few years ago called Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. She's a Harvard Business School professor. And in 2002, she wrote a book called The Support Economy. And it looked at the challenges to capitalism and shifting from a mass market to an individual-oriented structure. And she talked about how the world finally may be able to use technology to align the forces of supply and demand. So back in 2002, she was thinking that these tech companies could maybe actually finally create some form of an equilibrium for a lot of the world. But then she started realizing that these companies kind of opted out of this model and started realizing the quicker, cheaper, and more cost-driven method, which was just e-commerce and data and artificial advertisement gathering. And so what she notices in 2002 and then going into 2007 was that these companies, instead of aligning with maybe bettering the world economy, found the fast track to monetization. So then she wrote her second book called Surveillance Capitalism. And she talks about how basically these companies could have done the right thing. And instead, they've kind of gone down this road. And she defines, I'm just going to read it, surveillance capitalism as the unilateral claiming of private human experience as free raw material for translation into behavioral data. And I think that's interesting, because that's what we're seeing is these companies have kind of found an untapped resource, which is our data, our information. And there's been no limits on what they can do with it. So they actually have, in some ways, had the power to be a quasi-government because they know more about the citizens than the actual governments do. And it's horrifying to me.
Yeah. And it gets into all sorts of muddy waters, right? When you have, who, again, like that monopoly on understanding information and surveillance, right? You have time and time again, you see articles pop up where, like, the FBI wants to get into an Apple phone and Apple says no. In one instance, that might be a win for the private individual. In another instance, you could look at it as, wow, there's a major corporation that holds more power than the FBI. That could be good sometimes. That could be bad sometimes. Depends on what's inside that phone. So, yeah, I mean, it really has. We've created these behemoths. The modern world and the tech industry has created behemoths of data collection, but what do we do with that? How do we approach that? How do we maybe balance the scales so that they don't have such a monopoly on information and power? And I think, we both read an article from Wired that says, a lot of people, especially like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, have called for just, break up big tech, right? Kind of the quick slogan, break up big tech. But Wired has a really good article that, and I kind of bought it. I'll be honest, I bought that for a bit. I thought, and I still kind of do with something like Amazon, maybe, because they have more of a octopus unilateral control over production of actual products. Yeah, but as far as like tech industries like Google and Facebook, I was kind of on board with that idea of breaking them up. But then this Wired article actually kind of swayed me the other way, and at least just look at it differently. And maybe you can go into more of, why breaking something up, as far as like breaking up monopolies like we did in the turn of the 20th century, doesn't necessarily apply today.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, because I think it's an easy campaign slogan, like the article talks about, right? Break up Amazon, break up Facebook. Like, it's catchy, and I think it appeals to all of our kind of growing emotional sentiments about these big tech companies. But the article did a good job of saying that we're using antitrust framework from the beginning of the 20th century to work with tech companies that provide more of an abstract service than these industrial companies did, right? Like, the example they use is, I think the biggest one was Standard Oil was broken up, I think in 1910, in one of the biggest antitrust actions ever taken. But it actually isn't reported that much that eventually many of these companies coalesced again. The company's dozens of offshoots eventually recombined into massive oil companies that had major power. ExxonMobil and Chevron are the two most notable, and the Rockefeller family actually gained wealth from this process. The other one they use is in the 1980s, breaking up AT&T. This worked for a while, but it didn't account for this new wave of mobile data and cell phones. And eventually you kind of got this duopoly between AT&T and Verizon, with Sprint as kind of a third. But it really didn't break things up and spread out the wealth. It kind of still consolidated the wealth. And they use a modern example of Facebook, right? Like, you could break Facebook up into multiple companies like WhatsApp and Instagram and Oculus, and I think there's a few others that I'm skipping over. But the idea is that just because you're breaking up a company that has a market capitalization of over $600 billion doesn't mean it's actually going to break up this structure. And I think it's something worth talking about, is that sure, we can break up these tech companies, but we more need to redefine what privacy is, what surveillance means, and what is the role of these companies in the American system. Because on a bigger scale, I personally am just afraid that capitalism isn't compatible with democracy if it doesn't need to be. And we're seeing that in China and other countries in the East. And I think big tech is going to almost erode our democracy while maintaining our capitalist structure.
Right. Yes. I see what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, capitalism and democracy do not go hand in hand. They don't have to coexist.
Right.
They often have in the past. But we're seeing that you're right, that China is a capitalist country. Let's be real. I mean, they have a communist party, but I've said it time and time again, there are billionaires in China that own their own capital and continue to grow it. That's capitalism. It has nothing to do with how you can vote, because you can't in China. So that's a very good point. And I do think that, like, I think the nature of what we're talking about, like you said, is different than in the past, which you mentioned a little bit. One is, Standard Oil. If they're the only source of oil and you have to do any kind of business, any kind of logistical business with trucks or whatever, almost anything at the time, you had to buy from Standard Oil. You don't have to use Facebook. And frankly, I would encourage people not to, especially these days. I think it's a garbage social media site, especially today. I don't know if you saw, they just redid their whole user interface today, and I think it looks terrible. But anyway, that aside, but you don't have to use Facebook, right? There's no necessity of a service or good that you get from using Facebook. Google, on the other hand, is a little bit different. I mean, I guess you could use Bing, but who does? Google, I think, again, I don't think they should be broken up, because I don't know what that would do. But you really do have to look at what their responsibilities and the law is, because they can do things like work with foreign nations to help censor propaganda, even though they're an American country that claims to have ethics and for freedom and democracy. That is certainly needs to be looked at and I think regulated. And again, the amount of data that these companies are kind of trolling with wide nets is incredible. I've heard one idea, which again, I really don't know how this would turn out. So I'm not saying it as this would be a good idea, but one idea that I've heard touted is a law to compensate people for giving your information. So, the person that is giving out the data, right? Whatever I buy on Amazon or whatever, if a company wants to get that data, they'd actually have to pay me personally, not the company like Facebook that they did a deal with behind the doors. They'd have to pay the user. I think it's pretty radical, right? And I don't know how you'd even start a beginning apparatus of paying people for their data like that, or with like a PayPal account or something. But it's an interesting thought, right? Because it's like, okay, you're not going to stop the train of data being traded. You're just not going to stop that train at this point. But maybe you get the average consumer to get compensated for it.
Right. And I mean, first thing I'll say is on the breaking up thing, the quote I kind of came up with about this is, trying to break up big tech without a next step would be like, draining your bathtub, but your pipes are full of arsenic or lead, right? Like you're getting rid of the immediate problem, but if you don't actually change your pipes, what's it actually going to do? And I agree with you on that. I think there needs to be, either from the companies or from the consumer, some monetary reimbursement or monetary giving, I guess, from these companies. And I would flip it too, because I've heard another interesting one, because I think what you're saying could definitely work, but like you said, it would be difficult to add a quantity to that and just how to do that. But Sam Harris on his podcast last year brought on a guy who was pretty strongly anti these tech corporations, and they were talking about how another way that would work is subscription based services, right? Because a lot of the reasons why these tech companies are so willing to just use your data like it's the wild, wild west is because that's the only way they're getting revenue.
Right.
So why do you think Netflix and HBO and, I don't know, Sam Harris's podcast, which you have to now subscribe and pay to listen to, why do you think they are free from advertising and all these consent agreements and privacy protections? It's because you're paying for a service, so it's kind of behind a firewall. And so now there's other ramifications to that. Like, what if you can't afford to do that? What if you don't have access to these services? But I do think that, at least for some aspects of this problem, a firewall involving a subscription-based service could at least weed out these companies' necessity to find profits through your own data.
Yeah, I mean, we see that a lot. I mean, I've seen that a lot with like various news. I mean, you get, like various news outlets online, like The Economist or The Guardian or even the LA Times. You get like one or two free articles, and then they say, hey, after this, we really encourage you to pay for your media. I think that's like on the ground, right? As a consumer talking to buddy, yeah, I think people need to pay for their media. I'm a hypocrite. I don't do it often, but I eventually got an Economist subscription, and I have a Netflix subscription. But yeah, it is better for the consumer and the company for people to pay for their media. However, that being said, is if that's one thing if it's voluntary, right? If a company decides, if Sam Harris decides to have his podcast like that. But if we're talking about a legal action to then force people to have subscription-based, one is I think that's very hard to do politically anyway. But just for the sake of argument, let's say something like that happened. I think that would lead to more monopolization. I think smaller, apps or websites or whatever that I think they stay afloat because I mean you can see it, right? If you go to like local news channels on their website. They're obviously their demographic is only the Denver area or the Boise, Idaho area. They're packed with banner ads and click ads and drop down ads and video ads because that's the only way they can make revenue. If they were forced to go to a subscription service, I really don't think they'd be able to stay afloat with enough people in Boise, Idaho to pay $10 a month for their local news on their website. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, Netflix can do it because Netflix was able to garner such an attractive library of content. And places like The Economist and The Guardian can do it for now because they're trusted, well-written news sources that are established, have already been established in print. I think that if that was supposed to be forced, though, a lot of small mom and pop shop, quote unquote, websites and companies would go under.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely agree with that, where I think it would create somewhat of a market of haves and have-nots, right? And that wouldn't even be just the companies themselves, but that would also be the consumer. I mean, like to use the metaphor, or not the metaphor, but just kind of go off what you were saying on local news sites compared to, say, The Economist. Well, then you'd get some people, the people that can't afford a subscription are in any aspect of the internet would be on these local media sites where it's banners and ads and phishing data and collecting all your cookies. And then while if you can afford a subscription, you're in kind of this safe haven of technology, right? And so that would probably not solve the situation on a practical level for all Americans or all of the world. And I just think that at least there is sort of a backlash to tech, because I remember even 3-4 years ago, I think honestly, this goes back to what I've been saying about Trump and his election, where it kind of made us all kind of realize there's a lot of things going on and it's coming to the surface. Is I think before the 2016 election, a lot of people didn't realize how much of a cesspool social media and big tech in general has become. And at least that's out there. And I think at least people are starting to realize it. But I am concerned that the solution either way would kind of be bigger government intervention. And I think the appeal of a lot of this big tech is that they're not regulated by the government. So I don't know how you find an intermediary to that.
Yeah, true. I think, I think we're definitely it's a new realm, right? That's what's so tough about it, is like we've been talking about it. We can't really look to history like Standard Oil to understand what to do with big tech companies, because it really is a whole new realm of and especially when a lot of our politicians are probably so not well versed in this. I mean, I don't know. Do you remember that when Mark Zuckerberg was in front of Congress, and one of the congressmen had to ask him how he made money, and you're like, dude, ads, bro. What? Like ads and selling information. That's why we're here. Like, have you not gotten the memo on this? Like, so, yeah, we have to look at like new and interesting ways, maybe outside of the box ways to regulate this space for the benefit of privacy and security and the consumer. But I almost worry that because of our system, the government's always going to be a few years behind these tech companies anyway. Even if we had like legislation pending to regulate, these tech companies are just going to be ahead of the curve.
Damn, yeah, that's really true. Because that was a cringy hearing. I remember that, and I mean, Zuckerberg is cringe, but these guys managed to out cringe him in that. It was pretty bad, but like, gosh, I almost think. What do you think about the idea of maybe setting up, I don't know, a congressional committee, something like that, or maybe even a private public like task force? Like, I feel like there has to be something like that where you get the public sector at least working, or at least allowing insight into what is happening in the private sector. Like, there needs to be committees or something formed where at least there's a group of people that are appointed to this committee that understand the problem. Like the military, like the different foreign service and military committees in Congress are usually packed with veterans and foreign service hawks.
Right.
Like, why don't we have a committee inside of Congress? I keep saying the Congress like I'm 90, but inside of Congress, right, where you have people that understand it and maybe have a history of litigation against these companies or defending these companies, that at least can be there giving some guidance to our lawmakers when they need it. Because that interview showed that we're always going to be 5 years behind if we don't change something internally.
Definitely. I mean, yes, definitely. Any kind of coalition like that, if it doesn't already exist, I think would be a good idea. On top of that, I also think, back to kind of the TikTok thing, is we really need to get kind of our private security as well as national security in kind of on the same page. And one thing is like companies like Google and Facebook, I think there needs to be a law that they cannot be benefiting, like they cannot be going like censoring content in a country that has human rights violations. There has to be some kind of like there has to be some kind of pushback for that. I don't understand how Google can claim to be, an American country that pays taxes in Ireland, and then censors things, the Chinese government, for the sake of propaganda and a deal, like a backdoor deal. That just is so unethical to me and needs to be called out. And I just don't know exactly what kind of law you would have to do that, if it's a fine or whatever. But there has to be some kind of punishment for helping bad actors like the Chinese government or like the Russian government or something like that. And yeah, I mean, I really do think that maybe it takes more tech guys in politics. Maybe not Mark Zuckerberg. I don't think he's a good guy. I'm not saying him, But as more of these tech guys, like the guy, what's Jack Dorsey, I think is from Twitter, as some of these guys have kind of fulfilled and seen their vision come to fruition and maybe think about the next step, perhaps maybe not for president, but just maybe like a congressman or a woman or a senator at that level, it would be good to have some of these tech guys go into politics to have that perspective. But it also could be detrimental, right? There's obvious conflict of interest, like a Zuckerberg. I think was even trying to become a politician at one point, started doing like speaking tours and visiting churches, and everyone kind of saw through it. They were like, okay, you're not very likable. But a likable tech guy that could actually bring perspective and understanding of the industry and the actual, backdoor programming of it could be valuable. So I don't know. I hope that helps a little. I
say Mark Cuban for president then. And second off, I would agree. Like I think kind of going back to what you're saying, where these companies almost can operate differently depending on the country that they're operating in, because we saw that Facebook was almost instrumental in that Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. They were actually helping the Nationalist Party aid killing this Muslim minority just by misinformation and the advertising campaigns going on. And so what I would say is that I don't think these companies should be able to craft their politics for whatever country they're operating in. Okay, yes, maybe you limit a few things that maybe are culturally unaccepted in whatever country, or you applied to the cultural standards of whatever country. But I don't think that means omitting your values and your core principles as an organization. And I think that could start with, okay, you're an American company that, your founders and most of your employees operate under the American Constitution. Well, this company should be reflecting the American Constitution. And if it can't work inside of Myanmar because they're committing a genocide against a Muslim minority, then so be it. We're not going to operate in your country. Right. And unfortunately, no one's put their foot down about these type of things. And, I was actually surprised because TikTok pulled out of Hong Kong after these current changes between Hong Kong and mainland China. And I don't know if that's just a publicity stunt or proof that TikTok is independent from the actual Chinese ByteDance company. But that was interesting to me that TikTok, as well as WhatsApp and Facebook, all pulled out of Hong Kong, which maybe is a diamond in the rough a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of that. Does that mean you can't download it if you're in Hong Kong?
I think so, yeah.
I mean, look, TikTok again is just for 15-second music videos. Like, I think that's more of a publicity stunt. But like for something like WhatsApp, that almost might be detrimental to the people of Hong Kong if they're trying to communicate and organize using WhatsApp. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of a weird one. I'd have to think about that some more.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, we could definitely go on this for a long time. I think we've definitely touched the surface, and maybe we'll have to come back to this more because there's definitely a lot to talk about. But I do think that we could come to some agreement that I think at least there's a public recognition that something's wrong, and maybe that will bring this new wave of politicians like you were talking about.
Maybe, perhaps. For anyone listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if you have any experience, making apps or data collection and know more about that back end that we're not experts in. We'd love to have your input on this and shed some light. For everyone else, thanks again for listening. Stay tuned for our catching up episodes and our continuing major episodes twice a week. Thanks again.
Peace.